Good evening. Mark Twain once said that everybody talked about the weather, but nobody did anything about it. Well, it's much the same with inflation. Everybody's talking about it. No one tells us what we should do about it. One of the interesting things to me is the fact that the Liberal Party is now talking about inflation. I suppose 1958 will go down in history as the year in which the Liberal Party and the liberal newspapers discovered inflation. From 1945, when a Liberal government took off price control, the cost of living continued to rise every year at an average of almost 5% until 1956. And during all this time, neither the Liberal Party nor the liberal press said a word about inflation. During the past 2 years, the cost of living has gone up at only 2.5% per year. But lo and behold, the Liberal Party has discovered that we are suffering from inflation. Perhaps the fact that the Liberal government is no longer in office in Ottawa accounts for the fact that the scales have fallen from their eyes. Well, what are we going to do about inflation? It's not enough just to talk about it. We must do something, but the important thing is that we do the right thing. Now, as a matter of fact, the economic crisis through which we are passing is not inflation in the strict sense of the word. When we speak of inflation, we usually mean that there's too much money chasing too few goods. But there aren't too few goods today. As a matter of fact, we have a surplus of almost every manufactured commodity and every type of food. When we speak of inflation, we usually mean that there are more jobs than there are people. But at the present time, we have about 400,000 unemployed. When we speak of inflation, we usually mean that the whole price structure is rising. But today, prices for manufactured commodities are rising, but farm prices are dropping. Actually, our situation today is that we have a fine balance between inflation on the one hand and recession and unemployment on the other. And if we are not very careful and take the wrong measures to deal with inflation, we could precipitate a recession. And if we take the wrong measures to deal with a recession, we could precipitate ourselves into a spiral of inflation. Now, there are two great fallacies which, in my opinion, are being foisted upon the Canadian people. The first is that they're being told that inflation is due to high wages. Farmers and the white-collar groups are being told that all our economic ills are due to the trade unions who have been pushing for higher wages for the workers. And they say that if only wages weren't so high, then prices wouldn't rise and our economy would be in a healthy condition. This, to me, is the sheerest nonsense and will not stand the light of day under a close examination. Let me ask you to look at a few facts which are set out in these charts. Now, it is true that wages have increased, but it is equally true that productivity has increased even more rapidly. Let us look at the period from 1945 to 1955. We find that the average salary or wage went up in that period by 93.4%. But the net value of production went up by 111.7%. In other words, in that period of time, we paid out more wages, but we got more production, and that the increase in production was even greater than the increase in wages. Let us see, for instance, how this affects a particular industry, the farm implement industry. We are often told that the reason farmers are paying more for their machinery is because the workers are getting too high wages. But we find that from 1945 to 55, the average salary or wage in farm implements went up by 98.1%, but the net value of production went up by 102.4%. If you take any single farm implement and look at the percentage of its cost which is attributable to labor, you find that in 1945, 42.4% of the cost of your farm implement was labor, but in 1955, only 36.8% of the cost of your farm implement was attributable to labor. Therefore, when anyone tells you that your farm implement is costing you more because your labor cost has gone up, it's just not true. The labor cost in your farm implement has gone down from 42% to 36.8%. As a matter of fact, when people start to talk about higher wages being responsible for our increased cost of living, I wonder if they've ever looked at how inflation has affected the various economic groups in our community. It makes a very interesting study. Let me ask you to look at it. During the period 1945 to 1956, we find that farm prices have gone up 32.9%. But the cost of living has gone up 57.4%. So you can easily see that the farmer's cost of living has gone up much more rapidly than have his prices. Now, the average wages and salaries, not only of industrial workers, but professional workers and white-collar workers and executives, have gone up in the same period of time by 100%. They've done much better because they're highly trained and because in many cases they're highly organized. But how have corporation profits before taxes done during the same period? Well, they've gone up by 160.9%. Now, the newspapers and the propagandists who try to tell you that higher wages is the cause of all your misery never say a word about this 160% increase in profits by corporations, by those who clip coupons and live off dividends. You see, this is part of the old story of trying to play off the farmers and the workers against each other. They go to the farmer and they say the reason that your costs are going up is because the worker's wages are too high. And they say to the worker, the reason that the cost of living is so high is because you're paying too much for your food, and the farmer is making a lot of money and spending it by going to California in the wintertime. Of course, this is simply done by those who seek to exploit both the farmer and the worker and to keep them fighting with one another. You see, if the farmers would have their economic lot improved by low wages for the workers, then the farmers should have been very well off in the 1930s when we had 1 million unemployed and when industrial wages were very low. But the farmers weren't well off in the 1930s. Why? Because the workers either weren't working or didn't have the purchasing power to buy the farmers' products. I remember in 1937 making a speech in the House of Commons in which I said that if the industrial workers had more purchasing power, the farmers would be able to sell more produce at a better price. This was laughed at on that occasion, but here are the figures now which I think prove my point. If we look at the meat consumption per person in Canada, in 1937, each person in Canada ate 112.3 pounds of red meat. In 1956, this had increased to 154.1 pounds. If we look at poultry meat, in 1937, the per capita consumption was 18.3 pounds. In 1956, it had gone up to 31.6 pounds. What's the reason for this increase? Simply that in the 1930s, people didn't have the purchasing power to buy farm produce. And as purchasing power has increased, of course, the farmer has been able to sell more of his produce here in Canada. And this, of course, the same thing is true in terms of the farmer. The farmers today haven't got purchasing power, and that's why we've got unemployment. That's why the CCF are supporting deficiency payments, because we say that giving deficiency payments to the farmers would do more than any other single thing to cure unemployment, because it would give the farmers the purchasing power with which to buy furniture and shoes and clothing and radios and TV sets and washing machines and all the things that we have a surplus of, and thereby help to put our industrial workers back to work. And they, in turn, being put back to work would buy more farm produce. The thing we must realize is that the farmers and the workers are economically interdependent. They depend on each other's purchasing power. And that is why I believe that eventually they will come together politically, recognizing their affinity of interest and working together to see to it that the workers and the farmers of this country get their fair share of the national income. Now, I said there were two fallacies which the press of this country was trying to sell the public. The first was that increased wages were the cause of inflation. The other was that increased government expenditures was the cause of inflation, and that if only we could lower taxes, this would solve inflation. But the thing is this, that if we lower taxes on the people with high incomes, they will simply spend it buying more goods. So let me suggest to you what the CCF program is for curbing inflation. First of all, we say there must be selective price control. Our troubles started when we took price controls off. We don't need price controls on everything, but we do need price controls on those commodities which are too high. We don't need price controls on farm commodities. As a matter of fact, they're too low, and there are some other commodities that are too low. But we do need to control high prices. We need to control high profits. There may even be industries in which we need wage controls by tying wages to productivity. But we must have price controls, and this is the price, in my opinion, which we must pay if we are to stabilize our economy and curb inflation. Secondly, we say that we need a capital gains tax. To me, it is nothing short of criminal that we put an income tax on a single person with $1,500 a year income and on a married person with $2,400 a year income. And yet a man can make $10,000 or $20,000 playing the stock market, and he doesn't pay any income tax at all. In the United States, he pays a capital gains tax of 25%, but he pays nothing in Canada. We say there ought to be a capital gains tax, which will take out of circulation some of the surplus purchasing power. We say there ought also to be an excess profits tax, so that those who have made large profits will be compelled to pay them into the treasury, and then the money can go out to give purchasing power to those people who lack it. You see, the whole purpose of taxation is to redistribute wealth, to take purchasing power from people who have more than they need and put it out to those people who haven't got enough purchasing power to enable those people to buy the basic commodities which they require. The fourth step which we say must be taken is that we must have a national investment board. Undoubtedly, uncontrolled investment can cause inflation too. Now, the Liberal Party tried to cope with investment by what they called a tight money policy, and they said no one can get money. The Conservatives have tried to cope with this problem by wrecking the money market so that nobody can borrow money, and even if they can get it only at exorbitant rates of interest. We say this is not the answer. We must direct investment. It may be, for instance, that the automobile industry doesn't need $250 million in order to retool its plants to put out cars with a longer fin. But because they don't need that money, there's no reason why we should stop municipalities and provincial governments from getting money to build schools and hospitals and roads and sewer and water systems. In other words, we must redirect our investment for two purposes: for projects that will have social benefit and for projects that will put people to work. In other words, the CCF are saying that just as a businessman facing a problem will plan his affairs, and so as a husband and wife facing budgetary problems in their own home will plan their affairs, so the nation must plan its economy. And we must plan it in such a way that all the people who work with hand or brain on the farm or in the factory will get a fair share of the national income and thereby maintain a strong and healthy economy in Canada. Thank you, and good night.